Okay, welcome everyone. This is our new series for this year, Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. The first two in the series, many of you were probably there. We discussed time and space according to various Kabbalistic and Hasidic ideas about time and space, especially about the unity of time and space, as was revealed by Albert Einstein about 100 years ago, where he showed that time and space are intrinsically woven together, the time-space continuum. And so we discussed many different ideas in Kabbalah and Chassidut of where we could see that throughout our tradition, this idea of the unity of time and space. And the last 2 weeks, we did not record. But at the end of the last class, I said that starting tonight, we're going to do at least 2 classes and maybe 3. I have to see how much we get through on Eretz Israel. Because if we're talking about space, then we call it the Holy Land. So we're going to explore from many different perspectives what exactly does it mean, the Holy Land? What is special about Israel? What is unique about Israel? And to understand the whole concept of holiness as it applies to space and especially the land of Israel. So there are many, many, many different perspectives. So we're going to be looking at different ideas. They all ultimately connect together, but in a sense, they're different ideas that will reveal different faces of the Holy Land. So where I want to start is right at the essence of trying to understand what makes the land of Israel holy. So to do that, like we do for really any concept or idea, is we look at the word for holiness, and that is kedusha, kadosh. Comes from the 3-letter root, kuf, daled, shin. Kiddush on Shabbat, kiddushin in a marriage, Eretz HaKodesh, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. These are all variables of the same root. So if we want to understand holiness, we have to understand what does this word actually mean, kadosh, kadesh. So the simple, straightforward, but in a sense, the deepest understanding is that when it becomes a verb, up to now we mentioned this root as a noun or an adjective. But when it's a verb, lahakdish, it means to sanctify. But so what does to sanctify mean? In the simplest way, it means to separate. Because the example that is often given is that when a person would decide to bring an offering to the temple, so they would set aside an animal or amount of money or a certain gift. And once they separated this, they designated, they chose this object or this entity, it became hekdesh, meaning it took on a different status. It was now chosen, designated, separated, and therefore it became special. So to understand what holiness is, it means these words that we have just used, to separate, to designate, to sanctify, but ultimately to choose. In other words, if we're making Kiddush on Shabbos, it's because we've chosen to sanctify, to separate Shabbat from the 6 days of the week. When two people get married, it's because they have chosen each other exclusively instead of 8 billion other people that could have been chosen, but they chose one person to be married to. So to understand the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, we're going to take a series of ideas that we call holy. It's part of our tradition. So we call the land of Israel Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land. We call the Jewish people Am Kadosh, a holy people. We call Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, the holy city. We call the Torah holy. And we call Hebrew Lashon HaKodesh. There might be a few other that I left out, but there are not that many that we designate as being holy. So the question is, what connects them all? What is the idea that connects all the concepts that we term as being holy? And so the bottom line is that God chose all of these things to make it holy. The one we didn't mention is Shabbos. Many Hasidic Rebbes taught us that when we eat on Shabbos, that every few bites, L'kavod Shabbos Kodesh, for the honor of the holy Shabbos. So we're going to go through these ideas, and we're going to see that they became holy because God chose them to be holy. So we'll start with Abraham. These are the parshas that we have been reading, where the first time that God speaks to Abraham is when he tells him, Lech lecha me'artzecha, leave, go to yourself, or go out of your land and your birthplace and your father's house, El ha'oretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. So in other words, God had chosen out Eretz Yisrael for Abraham, because it says, to the land I will show you. He didn't say to Avram, you have a little understanding of real estate? Take a world tiyul, pick out the best place you can think of. That's where we'll make the Holy Land. It didn't work like that. God chose and made special and designated the land of Israel for Abraham. But if we go back a step, here we have, we'll call it a chicken and egg kind of question, where they're both true. Did God choose Abraham, or did Abraham choose God? And there's an aspect where both of these are true. The Ishbitzer Rebbe, there's a well-known midrash that reports how Abraham came to understand there was one God. Well, one of them, Abraham at a certain point says, like, who's in charge here? Who's in charge of the capital city? Who's running the show? And God spoke to him and said, I am in charge. So it appears that Avram, through his own initiative, came to understand there was one God and to choose to devote his life to spreading the knowledge of one God. But the Rebbe from Ishbitzer says a very interesting thing. He says, and who do you think put in Abraham's mind to ask that question? So here you see, like, it's a gray area, like what's called the arousal from above or the arousal from below. But either way, we see here we're going to say that God chose Abraham. And then he chose the land of Israel for Abraham. And according to tradition, he, especially in the book of Devarim, it talks, especially in Parshat Re'eh, where the Torah says over and over that we would bring our offerings and we would serve God in the place that I will show you. And that's Yerushalayim. So just like what we said about Avram and Eretz Yisrael is true about Yerushalayim also. But here we also have a chicken and egg, because we have a tradition that many, many things happened on the Temple Mount. According to tradition, Adam and Chava were created from the earth of the Temple Mount. And Noah, after the flood, came and offered offerings. And Avram brought Yitzchak to the Akedah. But here also is God showed him the place. God showed him the place where the Akedah would happen. Yaakov has his dream of the angels. So you have the arousal from below, but all of it is preceded from an arousal from above. And then we have Hebrew. According to our tradition, God created the world from the Hebrew letters. Those are the instruments of creation. And so the language, Hebrew, becomes holy, Lashon HaKodesh. And of course, what is the Torah? The Torah are the letters, are the Hebrew letters. And according to tradition, the Torah is created before this world. As it says in the Zohar, God looked into the Torah and created the world. So God designated Hebrew as a holy language, and he designated the Torah as the blueprint of creation. And the last one we'll talk about is Shabbat, where we have in the story of creation very, very clear that God separates, designates, chooses, and makes special Shabbat. So here, this is a very, very fundamental understanding of the concept of holiness. Now, we also make holy. God gave us the holidays. Shabbat, we don't designate Shabbat. Shabbat comes every week, and we do our best to fit into the time frame. But the holidays, even though they're written in the Torah, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, but it was the Sanhedrin that when they calculated how the months would work, they were the ones who actually designated which day the holidays would come out on. Because before we had a written calendar, it was in the hands of the Sanhedrin to designate which day is Rosh Chodesh. Depending on when Rosh Chodesh is, that depends when the holidays of that month would be. So here, just like there's a statement in the Talmud, just like God creates worlds, we have the ability to create worlds. So just like God can make holy, we can make holy. One of the best examples is a synagogue, a Beit Knesset or a Beit Midrash, where we take a building and we designate it. We give it a special status of a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, or a Beit Midrash. And there are many, many halachas of how one should act in a Beit Knesset or in a Beit Midrash. A whole series of halachot in the Shulchan Aruch. So that is something that we can do. We ultimately choose a mate, and through Kiddushin, through the ceremony of sanctification of the marriage, so we're making holy. Now here also we have a chicken and egg, because we have this concept, though it's actually very complicated and it's not as simple as it sounds, but we have a tradition that 40 days before the formation of the embryo, a voice goes out in heaven and says, this one is meant for this one. So here, sometimes we think we're doing all the choosing, but maybe it's been destined from before. This is actually a very, very complicated subject. We're not going to delve into it. But here again, we see that God makes holy, God chooses and designates. And we gave many different examples, but we also do. We also can designate and make holy. So all of this was just really an introduction to understand when we talk about the Holy Land, what we're talking about, and what we're trying to say here is it's holy because God designated it for the Jewish people to be holy. That is where the source of the holiness comes from. And it's a combination of the people and the land. That's why in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, at the end, where it predicts exactly how Jewish history would play itself out, and it talks repeatedly about a long, cruel, difficult exile. And it mentions that during that exile, the land would be barren. It wouldn't really grow for anyone else. Excuse me. I'm sure many people are aware of Mark Twain's famous letter. He came here to Israel in the 1880s, and he wrote this amazing letter where he was astounded by the barrenness and the emptiness of the land, because he read the Bible and all about the Holy Land, and he came and he just he couldn't believe how barren it was and how ungreen it was. A very, very famous letter that he wrote. And so when the Jewish people came back to Israel approximately 120 years ago, even though there was always a presence, there's always been a presence, but it was very, very small. But when people started coming back in mass, all of a sudden, the land turned green. And this is a truly modern miracle that it sounds like a cliche, and it is a cliche at this point, but Israel turned the desert green. And it has been exporting agricultural advice to nations around the world ever since. It's truly miraculous what has happened here and is continuing to happen. Okay, so all of that was just to get us into the matter of the Holy Land. But the two most important things is really when God says to Avram, leave your land and go to the place that I will show you. So there, like I said, there are many, many different ideas. So I want to now discuss the 4 holy cities of Israel. And the reason I did is because last week, the city of Hebron was in the spotlight. That's where Avram buried Sarah. That's where the cave of Machpelah is. It's also called Kiryat Arba. And I'm not sure exactly how it played itself out last week because I actually wasn't in Israel the last 2 weeks. But every year, sometimes tens of thousands of people go to Hebron for Shabbat on Chayei Sarah. And I imagine, I think I heard thousands came because of COVID. I think less than usual came, but still I heard thousands of people came. There were times where there were 20, 30,000 people, like there wasn't a house in Hebron or Kiryat Arba that wasn't hosting people on their floor. It's a beautiful tradition because there all the avot and the imahot are buried except Rachel, and according to tradition, Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve are buried there also. So I just want to mention very briefly about the 4 holy cities. We'll start with Hebron. And we're told that the 4 holy cities, I'm not sure what the source of this idea is, but it connects to the 4 elements. So we're told that Hebron is connected to the earth. There are many, many reasons for that. One of them is because of the burial, because the patriarchs and the matriarchs are buried in the ground in Hebron, and it's called Machpelah, comes from the word kaful, which means double. And Rashi explains that it was a double cave. So today, when people go into the building and they have what looks like burial places, the real cave is below. There's a second cave below. Now they build a building over the entire cave, but it's called the double cave. And another reason is because pairs were buried there. Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah, and Adam and Chava. Again, from the word kaful, double. And that's one of the reasons that it's called Kiryat Arba. One reason Rashi brings is that there was a family of giants there. And there were 4 giants, or that the father's name was Arba. But then it's also named after the 4 couples buried there. So why is it connected to the earth? Like we said, because they're buried in the earth. And according to tradition, what we say about Yerushalayim, that Yerushalayim is like a vortex, a ladder. That's the significance of the ladder in Yaakov's dream, because it connects heaven and earth. That's why it says that the ladder was entrenched in the earth and its head reached the heavens. And so we're told that there's even a tradition that all prayer, no matter where we are on the planet, all prayer comes to Yerushalayim from every distance and then ascends. That's one tradition. But it's said about Hebron, the root of Hebron is chaver, which means friend, or chibur, which means connection. That's why the word for friend is the same as connection. When people connect together, they become friends. So here we're told that this is a chibur, not only from earth to heaven, but more so from this world and the world to come. And that's the significance that right after Avram buries Sarah, it says, V'Avraham Zakein, Ba B'Yamim, V'Hashem Berach et Avram Bakol. That Avraham became old, and we're told it means old in wisdom, and he came into days, and God blessed Avram with everything. Now, this expression is a very well-known expression to darshan. These are many perspectives. What does it mean? He came into days. Without going into the bigger picture of what that means, one of the explanations is that because of Sarah, actually, Avram was now able to have 1 foot in this world and 1 foot in the world to come. That he was able to, in the present, he was able to have the consciousness of past, present, and future, and he was able to combine the consciousness of this world and the world to come. So that's Chevron. Chevron is connected to earth. Yerushalayim, we're told, is connected to fire. Why is it connected to fire? Because the Beit HaMikdash was there, and that was the place where the offerings were brought, and there was a continual fire on the Mizbeach for the entire time of the temple. It never went out. No matter rain, snow, wind, it never went out. It was a Eish Tamid to Kad al Mizbeach, Lo Tichbeh. It's actually a commandment in the Torah that a continual fire shall burn in the altar. Do not let it go out. But it was also the place of the menorah. The menorah were a smaller fire, but it was flames. It was fire. And it's also the place of Torah, because what is the prophecy of Yeshayahu, Isaiah? Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, that from Zion will come the Torah. Now, what's interesting is we know that we got the Torah at Sinai, but there's a midrash, very interesting midrash, that says Sinai has 6 different names. There's 6 different ways that the mountain of Sinai is referred to in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And one of them is Moriah, Hara Moriah, which we usually think of as Harabayit, as the Temple Mount, because that's where Avram, that's where God said, go to the land of Moriah. And he went to the Temple Mount. For those of you who have been in Yerushalayim, and you know the Tayelet that is in the south of Yerushalayim, because it says in the Torah, and Avram lifted up his eyes, and he saw the place from afar. And according to tradition, this Tayelet is a what do you call it? It's a walkway, and it's on a hill. And on the other side of the hill, it goes down. So according to tradition, Avram came up to this hill, and when you stand there, you see the entire city of Yerushalayim. It's one of the most beautiful, awe-inspiring views in the world. And according to tradition, Avram, when he got there, it says he lifted up his eyes and he saw the place from afar, because he still had a ways to go, but he could see the Temple Mount. To this day, you could see the Temple Mount. So here, when we say in the future, ki mitzion teitzei Torah u'devar Hashem mi Yerushalayim, and the Torah is called fire. In the last portion of the Torah, Zot Bracha, the Torah is referred to Eish Dat, a fiery knowledge, a fiery entity. So Torah also is called fire. And if you remember, beautiful story in Pirkei Avot, there were 5, this is in the Gemara. It's talking about the students of Hillel Hazaken, the famous Hillel. And it starts with the least of them. The least of them was Yochanan ben Zakkai. And in the Talmud, it lists a long list of what he was able to know and to perceive. And it included the whole law, the whole tradition, but he also could converse with angels. He could converse with nature. He knew the secrets, what's called Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkavah, the secrets of the Torah. And that was the least of the students. So the Gemara asks in astoundment, if that was the least of his students, what was like the greatest one? And that was Yonatan ben Uziel. Many of you have been to his burial place in Israel called Amukah, which is outside of Tzfat. And it's in this, Amukah comes from the word Amok Emek. It's deep in a valley. It's surrounded on two sides by mountains. And deep in the valley is this burial place of Yonatan ben Uziel. So the Gemara said, well, okay, so what was so great about him? So it says that when he was sitting and learning Torah, if a bird would fly over his head, no matter how high, it would get singed by the fire coming out of his mind. Where is that fire coming from? The Torah itself. The Torah is a holy fire. That's why one of the most famous books that came out of the Holocaust by the Piaseczner Rabbi is called Eish Kodesh, a holy fire. And this was his Torah on the Parshiot that he wrote in the Warsaw Ghetto. So that's Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is fire. Tiberias is water. That's also an obvious one because it sits on the largest body of water, of fresh water in Israel, is Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And Tiberias sits right there. And so it's all about water. According to tradition, Miriam's well mystically, magically ends up in Yam Kinneret. Miriam's well is the ability to draw water in the desert wherever we were, coming from the zchut of Miriam. And somehow, according to tradition, it is in the Sea of Galilee. And there's a famous story of the Arousal and his primary student, Rabbi Chaim Vital. As we know, the Arousal was one in a millennium. I mean, truthfully, he was unique beyond comparison. And his student, who was also a genius of genius, was having a hard time absorbing the teachings. So the Arousal took him to Yam Kinneret. They took a boat, and at a certain place, the Arousal stopped the boat, and he told Chaim Vital to take a cup of water and to drink it, and then he would be able to understand the teachings he was given over. There's a very, very famous story about the Arousal and Chaim Vital. So Tveria is all about water. And there's also hot springs there around Tveria. There are hot springs. And the last one is the holy city of Tzfat, which is one of our famous, favorite places. My wife and I have been going there every summer for well over 20 years now. We spend a couple of weeks in Tzfat. If our good friend Olivia Schwartz is online now, or someone who knows her could tell her that for many years, Olivia and her late husband, Schwartzy, would be in Tzfat every summer also. And Sfat is air. Anyone who's been in Sfat knows that the air of Sfat is rarefied. It is mystical. There's something unworldly about the air of Sfat. And we have an expression that that the air of Eretz Yisrael makes you wise. Avira to Eretz Yisrael machkim. The air of Israel makes you wise. And that's all of Eretz Yisrael, but you really feel it in Sfat. Just anyone who's been there, I'm sure knows what I'm talking about. So these are the 4 holy cities. And here's a connection, a beautiful idea of connecting them to the four elements. Okay, so many other ideas, but the next one I want to mention is a very, very important idea. In a sense, there are 3 covenants that we have. There's the covenant, what we call Brit Milah. Brit literally means covenant. It's circumcision. That is, we're taught in the end of Parshat Lech Lecha, is the covenant in the skin, in our bodies. Then we have the covenant with the Torah, that actually in a couple of places that we talk about Israel when we came to Sinai, and then later when we came into Eretz Yisrael and we went to the 2 mountains of Har Eval and Har Gerizim, and even in the desert in Moab, we renewed the covenant that we have with the Torah. But the point I want to make is there's another covenant, which is really the first covenant, and it's also in Parshat Lech Lecha, and that is the covenant with the land. And this is what's called Brit Ben Abetarim, the covenant between the pieces. And this is also in Parshat Lech Lecha, but it's significant that it comes before the covenant of Brit Milah in our actual bodies. And that's when Avram seemingly complains, who is going to inherit me? At that point, Avram and Sarah had no children. And he says, who's going to inherit me? And God takes him outside and says, if you can count the stars in the sky, that will be how many your seed will be. And then God says, and this land I will give to you for eternity. And Avram says, how will I know this? And then an incredible ceremony takes place. We don't have time to get into all the symbolism, but literally every verse in this covenant of the pieces is prophetic. And Rashi, if one would take the time to learn the Rashis on this section, gives us some of the symbolism here. But in short, God tells Avram to cut up different animals and to make 2 rows with them. And at a certain point, a deep darkness or a deep sleep, it's not really a sleep, a deep state of consciousness overcame Avram. And he walks through these pieces. That's why it's called the covenant of the pieces. And in that whole symbolic ceremony, God promises that this will be your land and your children's land forever. So because the subject of this whole evening is about Eretz Yisrael and the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, it's so significant that even before our covenant with the Torah, and even Brit Milah, circumcision, comes the covenant with the land. And this tells us why even 2,000 years could not break that bond between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel. Because a covenant is something that can't be broken. It's in a different category than an agreement or a promise or a vow. It's a different category, a covenant. And so the covenant with the land it's unbreakable. And that it's such an important part. It's a simple idea, but it's so important, especially in our day, where there is all kinds of politics around what is Eretz Israel, who has the right to it, who can settle it. So even though it's based in the Torah, but it's a very contemporary question. It's a very, very timely idea. Is our connection to the land of Israel because of security, which is true, but if it's only security, then we're missing a big part of the picture. There's a covenant, there's a promise from God. That's why it's called the Promised Land or the Holy Land. And that it's coming from this whole idea. So if anyone wants to go back to Parshat Lech Lecha, here you have two of the covenants, Brit Milah and the covenant with the land. It's called the covenant between the pieces. Okay, now I'm just looking at all the different ideas. Whatever we don't get to this week, we're going to get to next week or the week after. Okay, so I think the best way that we could wrap this up, this is a teaching of Rav Ginsburg. We always try to bring his Torah into whatever we're learning. And he talks about the idea that there are four different types of love. One of his books, Ahava v'Ratzon, and hopefully a book in English will come out at some point. There's this whole idea of 13 different relationships of love between God and Israel, and between Israel and God, between us and the Torah, between couples, between friends, between families. And so there's 13 different relationships of love between siblings, but they come in four categories. And this fits in very, very beautifully what we're teaching tonight, and it goes according to the Sfirot. So the four cardinal loves are the love of God, the love of Torah, the love of Israel, and the love of the land. These are, Rav Ginsburg speaks a lot about these four types of love. And of course, they're all unified. They're very connected to the four letters of God's name. And these four types of love, they all merge together. And so I think that's where we'll stop tonight. And as always, we'll leave time for discussion. But this is a good place to start, because to be a whole person, we need to have all four of these types of love. In other words, if one of these is missing, and I'll give some examples without, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, but there are, let's say, this hypothetically, there are people who learn Torah day and night, but maybe they don't have so much love of Israel. And then there are people who really love Israel and don't learn Torah so much. There are people who love the land and are totally moser nefesh for the land, but maybe they're missing one of these loves. And there are people who at least profess to really love God, but don't like people so much. So I think you get the idea that we need all four of these types of love to be a complete person. And each of the four complements each other. So I'll end with a blessing that each one of us has to look into our own hearts, our own minds, and ask ourselves, are we really trying to nurture all four of these types of love? And if so, how are we doing it? And maybe how can we improve? I just learned, because Rosh Chodesh Kislev is coming, so I learned a Torah from Rav Ginsburg on the month of Kislev. And it's a long piece, and just one of the, I'll say the side ideas is the whole idea of why are we serving God? And he says someone could be learning Torah all the time. Someone, they do love God, and they do love Israel, they do love the land, but deep in their consciousness, they're doing all of this because it makes them feel good. It turns them on. That's actually in Hebrew, ledalek, to be turned on, to be sparked. And we know from our own beings and how society works, everyone wants instant gratification these days. And so he goes into it quite deeply, this idea, are we serving Hashem because we get high from it? Is that why we're doing it? Because it makes us feel good? Or we're serving Hashem because, very simply, we're actually commanded to serve Hashem. And if we get turned on, that's great. Everyone wants to feel satisfied and pleasure and goodness, but he was just asking very deeply, what is the motivation? When I'm davening, is it because it makes me high? Or is it because it's serving? Do I do other people favors because of the honor that it will bring me, or the accolades that it will bring me? Or am I doing favors for people because I really want to do good for people? Because it's the right thing to do. It's what we're told we should do because it's good. It's good for the world. And if it's good for me too, that's great. Anyways, I'm just applying it to these four loves now that really should think about why we should nurture these four types of love and how we're going about it. I know when I read this piece, it started my wheels turning, so I'm just sharing it with you. So we should all be blessed with a true, sincere, holy love of God, love of the Torah, love of the people of Israel, and of Eretz Israel.